Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. Today we'll be talking with AOPA General Counsel Justine Harrison and AOPA Attorney Jared Allen about a court decision in the Warbirds Adventures Case and both its immediate and potential future impact upon flight schools and flight instruction. And after the news, we have lots of your emails and questions to share. Last week in episode 188, we talked with Eric Gunderson about the mid-air collision involving a Cirrus and a Metroliner near Denver. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out. And I'd like to ask you for your help right now. Take just a moment to share this show with a friend who you think might enjoy it, and then follow up with him or her and suggest that they subscribe to the show. If you're using the Apple Podcast app, just look for the three dots at the bottom. Thanks so much for your help. This week in the news, a Grumman Tiger pilot got a big scare when he thought he was being shot at. 2 pilots were fired after an incomplete pre-flight inspection that led to some aircraft damage, and a helicopter was used in an unusual way at a high school. All this and more, and the news starts now. From AOPA.org, this is about the Warbirds Adventures Case. Many AOPA members have been reaching out to us about the recent court decision to allow an FAA emergency cease and desist order to stand against Warbirds Adventures, a company that was providing flight instruction in a limited category warbird without an exemption for such an organization. The decision leaves many questions and concerns in its wake. It's useful to analyze the decision from 2 perspectives: 1, immediate impacts, and 2, potential future impacts. And by the way, there was an article published online by a major magazine that suggested flight schools and even independent CFIs might have to get a Part 135 certificate to teach, which would be a substantial burden. So to get to the bottom of this, I spoke with AOPA's General Counsel Justine Harrison and AOPA Attorney Jared Allen, and you'll hear that conversation later in the show. From avweb.com, Grumman Tiger intercepted by F-16s with flares inside a presidential TFR. F-16s intercepted a Grumman Tiger that violated a TFR involving President Biden's visit to his home in Delaware, according to a Secret Service statement. On May 16th at approximately 1 p.m., a small aircraft violated the restricted airspace in Wilmington, Delaware. Per standard protocol, U.S. military aircraft responded, the aircraft was intercepted, and the pilot redirected to a local airport. The Grumman pilot told John Martin, director of aviation at New Garden Airport in Pennsylvania where he landed, that he and his wife were returning home to an unspecified New York airport from Ocean City, Maryland, and were unaware of the TFR. Martin said both were shaken up, adding not only were they intercepted by F-16s, but they thought they were being shot at by the flares. A Defense Department spokesman confirmed, quote, the NORAD fighter dispensed signal flares during the intercept in an effort to gain the pilot's attention and direct them safely out of the restricted zone. Martin said the pilot was later interviewed by the Secret Service and flew the Tiger home from New Garden the next day. Martin said this was the first aircraft since Biden's inauguration to be intercepted and then land at N57, though he said the FAA told him that there have been between 4 and 7 interceptions every weekend there is a TFR, and that most land at nearby Chester County Airport. Martin expressed frustration over the presidential TFRs, which effectively shut down the airport. He shares some of the same frustrations experienced by New Jersey and Florida airport operators during weekend presidential TFRs during the last administration. From mlive.com, airline fires 2 pilots after emergency door flew off Upper Peninsula-bound airplane just before takeoff. 2 pilots have been fired after an airplane's emergency exit door was ripped off moments before a flight to Michigan's Upper Peninsula. WLUC-TV reports that Boutique Airlines pilots failed to complete a pre-flight checklist, causing the door to open before takeoff. Tom Yan of Wakefield said his carry-on bag was sucked out of the opening during a flight from Minneapolis to Ironwood, which would be in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Several other passengers also relayed their uncomfortable experience during the incident during a Gogebic Iron County Airport Board meeting on Monday. Quote, we're not trying to hide or deny anything, Sean Simpson, CEO of Boutique Airlines, said during the meeting. WLUC also reported the San Francisco-based airline plans to resign from their contract with the Gogebic Iron County Airport, but did not give a reason why. Boutique is the small Upper Peninsula airport's only commercial airline. Boutique Airlines will continue to provide service until the airport finds other options, according to the TV station. And the story doesn't mention what type of aircraft are being flown, but the website for Boutique says they fly both Pilatus PC-12s and King Air 350s. From the Air Force website at af.mil, Washington State Patrol pilots successfully test special laser eye protection developed at Wright-Patterson Labs. And my thanks to Isaac Alexander, who sent me the story. You can find him on Twitter at JetCityStar. The story says aiming a laser at an aircraft is a federal crime that can net offenders up to 5 years in jail or cost them a $250,000 fine. Even with this heavy potential penalty, laser strikes have become increasingly more common. According to the FAA, 6,852 such incidents were reported in 2020 compared with 385 in 2006. And so far this year's incidents of joy lasing are up 20% over last year. Laser strikes are almost always made at low altitudes where an aircraft is taking off or preparing to land, the two parts of flying that require the most attention from a pilot. Most laser eye protection works by filtering out green or red light, the colors most commonly used in handheld lasers. Unfortunately, according to FAA studies and years of pilot experience, this can change the pilot's ability to accurately read the instrument control panel. A 2019 FAA report suggested that this problem might be fixed by changing the type of lighting in the control panel. Researchers at the Air Force Research Laboratory recently came up with a better solution, one that was successfully tested on the job by Washington State Patrol pilots. According to lab personnel, they used the cockpit compatibility design software that they have, and they modified it for commercial use. The commercial version, called CALI, C-A-L-I, for Commercial Aviation Low Intensity, filters out the laser light, but not the light coming from the pilot's instrument panel. Simply put, they said, the lenses maximize protection while minimizing the impact to the cockpit. The researcher explained that during the riots in 2020, law enforcement reached out to the community and asked who knows anything about laser eye protection. The 711th Human Performance Wing and the Naval Medical Research Unit, Dayton, also at Wright-Patterson, all juggled a number of briefings about what is available in the industrial base, effects on human factors, etc. Most of the eye protection available to the police was the standard issue non-CALI type. However, one particular group of aviators in Washington State tried the CALI products and decided they were heads and shoulders above the others. One of those aviators was Trooper Pilot Tactical Flight Officer Cameron Iverson of the Washington State Patrol. Iverson said, "We have some new laser glasses we were supposed to test out that the Air Force had developed. I know we were the first ones to test them." He explained that the aircraft he flies gets around 20 to 25 laser strikes a year. He said, quote, "We've been finding about 80% of the violators. We can spot the source of the laser light using an infrared camera and then walk other law enforcement officers to the address or location and actually apprehend these people." Unlike the non-CALI lenses, color perception is minimally affected. Quote, "It doesn't distort colors too tremendously bad," said Iverson. "It does darken up white, making it look more yellowish, but your reds and blues, even your greens that are displayed on the instrument panel screens, still look red, blue, and green." And he said, "Just last night we had another 2 laser incidents and the glasses worked great." Well, this is an awesome story. I think for years I thought that eventually we would find a way to reduce the number of laser strikes through education of the public. I'm now convinced that probably the long-term solution is for pilots to wear laser eye protection when they fly at night. From DuluthNewsTribune.com, portable music speaker ripped off float plane propellers during takeoff at Duluth Sky Harbor Airport. Quote, "It wasn't until I sat down and began to fill out the NTSB paperwork at my computer as I was going to listen to some music that I discovered what I believed had happened," the pilot wrote. A portable speaker left on a float plane at Duluth Sky Harbor Airport ripped off the plane's propeller last year during takeoff, according to the NTSB. In its final report, the NTSB determined the 2020 incident's probable cause was, quote, "the pilot's failure to remove an object from the airplane's exterior, which impacted the propeller blades when he applied full power, causing them to fracture and damage the airplane." No injuries were reported, and the pilot and his passenger were able to put life jackets on and escape the substantially damaged aircraft before it began to sink in the Duluth Superior Harbor. According to the NTSB, the pilot of an Icon A5 amphibious airplane taxied on the water before facing into the wind for takeoff and applying full power. About 5 seconds later, the pilot heard a loud bang. He shut down the engine, climbed out of the plane to look back, and saw all 3 of the propeller blades were gone. Quote, "It is likely that the audio speaker, which was left on the airplane, struck the propeller blades, which resulted in the propeller blades separating from the propeller and penetrating the fuselage," the NTSB said. The pilot told investigators he has not been able to find the speaker since the incident. From planeandpilotmag.com, survey results, pilots are overwhelmingly for restrictions on government's use of ADS-B for enforcement. And they talk about a recent survey the magazine did of whether government agencies should face greater restrictions and how they use ADS-B data for enforcement actions. And I think the magazine probably did this survey as a result of the Martha Lunkin incident that we talked about back in episode 185, in which she flew under a bridge. The story says, our first question was a hot-button one, quote, should the FAA have the right to use ADS-B data to find examples of violations that are not otherwise reported to them? And I'm pretty sure there's a typo here in the story. I'll tell you what the story says and what I think it should say. It says our first question was a hot-button one. Should the FAA have the right to use ADS-B data to find examples of violations that are not otherwise reported to them? 3/4 of those who answered the survey questions thought that such fishing expeditions should be allowed, and I think they meant should not be allowed. And it continues on, while just over 10% thought it was okay in some instances, with just 7% thinking it was just flat out okay. And by putting the word not in, that would make it consistent with the headline, which says pilots are overwhelmingly for restrictions on government use of ADS-B for enforcement. Continuing on, but as our original story found, it's not just the FAA that's using ADS-B against pilots. State agencies and even counties and cities are turning to the data as well. Our question, should government agencies other than the FAA be allowed to use ADS-B data for enforcement of airspace, landing, or other violations? A whopping 82% of respondents answered with a no, with fewer than 10% thinking such uses of the data should be permissible, and 17% thinking it was okay in certain unspecified incidences. We also ask, would you be for new federal regulations limiting the FAA's use of ADS-B for enforcement action against pilots? 87% of survey takers thought that was a great idea, with 11% thinking that we should leave Congress out of the conversation and 2% declining to answer. So no big surprise, pilots would not like to see ADS-B used for enforcement purposes. From AOPA.org, rudder misapplication cited in fatal King Air crash. NTSB determines probable cause of 2019 plunge into hangar. Investigators found no faults in the left engine of a Beechcraft King Air 350 that stopped producing power just before the aircraft rolled to inverted and crashed into a hangar 17 seconds after takeoff from Addison, Texas on June 30th, 2019. The crash killed both pilots and 8 passengers on a private flight to Florida. So the NTSB has just come out with their final probable cause on this, which essentially says that it's pilot error, and we'll be interviewing someone in a future episode to talk about this story in more detail. And here's some updates on stories we've talked about in recent episodes. This one comes from WFMJ.com. Judge refuses to dismiss low YSU, that's Youngstown State University, stadium flight case against pilot. In a 9-page ruling handed down, Youngstown Municipal Court Judge Carla Baldwin dismissed a petition to have the case against pilot Christopher Wilkinson thrown out. In November 2019, authorities charged Wilkinson with inducing panic and disorderly conduct after allegedly flying a single-engine Cessna close to the press box and stadium lights while fans were watching the September 28th game against Robert Morris. Wilkinson's lawyer said it should have been up to the FAA to prosecute Wilkinson and not the city. The ruling says, in part, other state courts have found that laws criminalizing unsafe operation of an aircraft are not preempted by federal law. And in a similar outcome, in a similar story, this comes from the EastHamptonStar.com, David Wisner, the low-flying pilot who was charged with second-degree reckless endangerment after buzzing Sag Harbor, Long Island, at around 5:30 p.m. on April 13th this year, and minutes before that, areas of Springs, was arraigned on May 7th in Sag Harbor Village Justice Court for the alleged misdemeanor. Mr. Wisner's 90-day ban from East Hampton's airport is ongoing. And here's another update. Massachusetts bill to charge a $1,000 landing fee to be revised. This comes from GeneralAviationNews.com. A Massachusetts state senator who proposed a bill to charge a $1,000 landing fee for virtually all GA aircraft now says he plans to, quote, extensively revise the bill before it comes before the relevant committee, according to a report by Gordon Gilbert of Aviation News International. The Massachusetts state senator initially proposed, quote, an act to mitigate the climate impact of private and corporate air travel, unquote, to reduce carbon emissions generated by what he sees as luxury aircraft owned by the ultra-wealthy. He said, from feedback I've received from aviation advocates and others about the bill, it's clear that more exemptions should be included, specifically flights used for pilot training, sightseeing tours, and smaller Cessna-like airplanes, or those registered in Massachusetts and owned by a Massachusetts resident. So we'll keep track of that story, and those are our updates. Finally in the news, if you dry it, They will come. Carrollton's rally to dry baseball field for district play. This comes from KMZU.com. In Carrollton, Missouri, it says rain has soaked most of the KMZU listening area, putting a damper on many high school baseball district tournaments. One high school went all out to make their field playable. Carrollton High School is the host and number 1 seed in the Class 3 District 16 baseball tournament. Since the tournament began, it has been idle due to heavy rainfall and wet field conditions. Coaches, players, and administration from CHS, the Carrollton Park Superintendent, and other members of the community worked diligently to dry the soaked field. Manual labor, rakes, shovels, ATVs, and even a helicopter were used. And they include video and pictures of the drying process. And let me pass along our best luck to Carrollton High, and congratulations for your ingenuity in using a helicopter to help dry your baseball field. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, your letters and questions, and we'll talk with attorneys from AOPA about the Warbirds Adventure ruling and its effect on flight instruction. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's go to some of your emails and questions. I used to put these toward the end of the show, and if the show ran long, I would end up dropping them. But I think I'll go ahead and start putting those up a little earlier in the show and see if we include more of them in the future, because some of these are just great. This comes from Dick in Florida. He's a major in the Civil Air Patrol. He says, "Can't tell you how much I enjoyed and learned from your interview with John Tugas." Now, that was episode 184 about a Boeing test pilot who had an engine-out emergency and how he handled it. He says, "I sent a copy out to almost all of my pilot and Civil Air Patrol contacts concerning the comment on the hemispheric rule in the lower peninsula of Florida," which he said would be basically below the Interstate 4 Orlando area. "The rule is different. It runs north for even altitudes and south for odd altitudes." Never heard that before. He says, "The folks in the Florida Keys, or the Conch Republic, pride themselves on being different. Some visitors might consider them odd. That's how I've come to remember south odd, north even." Well, that's funny. Thanks so much, Dick. And yeah, I visited the Keys a couple of times many years ago, and I just love that part of Florida. And this comes from Raphael, who's also coincidentally in Florida, regarding episode 185 and Martha Lunkin. He says, "In regards to Miss Lunkin's under-the-bridge escapade, I have found that many pilots have responded to it with 2 hazardous attitudes that we are taught to avoid: anti-authority and invulnerability. Makes me wonder how safe we really are up there with so many pilots who selfishly feel she did a good thing, adding to Lunkin's own impulsivity, another hazardous attitude." And just to review the hazardous attitudes, we talked about these in episode 154, where we talked about a Class B violation in Las Vegas area. Hazardous attitudes are macho, impulsivity, resignation, invulnerability, and anti-authority. And some researchers have proposed a 6th one, which is loss of face. Here's some comments from episode 187. This comes from Sherry in Oregon. She says, "I recently listened to your episode 187 talking about hearing loss. While the information given on the show was pertinent, I feel you did not address some important points for pilots who fly with hearing loss. 1. At the first sign of hearing loss, get a hearing test and get fitted with hearing aids. When getting fitted, the most important factor is the hearing professional who does the fitting. Real ear measurements is a must. 2. I was hoping to hear some discussion as to how pilots with hearing loss cope in the flying environment. I'm one of those pilots. I set my hearing aids to telecoil-only mode and use a Lightspeed Zulu 3 noise-canceling headset. Lightspeed earmuffs can fit over my ear and the hearing aid. I carry a backup pair of hearing aids or HAs and regularly change the headset ear padding. There are pros and cons to this and other solutions." Sherry, thank you so much for sharing this information. Now, you used the word telecoil, which I was not familiar with, so I went out to nchearloss.org, which is the North Carolina Hearing Loss Association, and here's what I learned. It says a wonderful feature available on many hearing aids is called the telecoil. It's also referred to as a T-switch or T-coil, a tiny coil of wire around a core that will induce an electric current in the coil when it's in the presence of a changing magnetic field, which, by the way, would be like a speaker. A telecoil, therefore, is an alternate input device for a hearing aid. Normally, a hearing aid listens with its microphone, then amplifies what it hears. But with a telecoil used as the input source instead of or in addition to the microphone, the hearing aid can hear a magnetic signal which represents sound. And it says on telecoil-equipped hearing aids, the wearer must turn on or switch to telecoil mode by moving a small switch on older models to the T position or by changing to a program mode by pressing a button on the ear-level device or on a remote control. that is set up to use the telecoil as an input source instead of or in addition to the microphones. Some users prefer a mode that only uses the telecoil and not the microphones when they are in telecoil mode, and others prefer a combination of telecoil and microphones. There is no right way for everyone, but there may be a best way for each person. And it says originally the telecoil was meant to hear the magnetic signal naturally generated in an older telephone, which must be the source of the name telecoil, whose speaker was driven by powerful magnets. This allowed someone with a hearing aid to hear the telephone better if they just turned on or switched to their telecoil as an input source for their hearing aid. And now there are many more magnetic sources that can be heard by a telecoil-equipped hearing aid. Well, that is great information. Thanks so much for passing that along, Sherry. And here are some comments about last week's episode 188 on the mid-air collision over Denver. From Scott in Colorado, he says, really enjoy your work, Max. Do we know if the Cirrus involved in the mid-air was a G5 or G6 with a higher CAPS minimum altitude? And yes, Scott, it was a 2016 aircraft, which would make it a G5. And yes, typically people would teach that you want to be at least 600 feet in a climb before pulling that parachute, whereas in the older aircraft, which are lighter and have a somewhat smaller parachute, 500 feet would be a typical altitude where people would first consider using the parachute as they climb. Though Cirrus says that there is no minimum altitude because there may be circumstances where you might still want to pull the parachute at lower altitudes. And from William in Missouri, he says, I listened to your show on the Centennial Midair. I'm curious about the proper go-around for the Cirrus once he realized he was too wide on the approach. Assuming he would have figured this out on the base turn, does he just continue straight, in other words, continue the base leg and contact tower? This would put him crossing the approach for 17 left. He didn't turn left or right. Does he just hope that there is no one on approach for the parallel? Perhaps he did realize he was going to be too wide, but the timing was such that there was a plane in his way. And William, thanks so much for your thoughts on that. Yeah, it's an interesting thought. I don't think people often give a whole lot of thought to what do you do for a go-around on the base. My reaction to that is as soon as one recognizes any kind of an issue where you should go around, immediately add full power and climb. And then if you're on a base, I would turn parallel to the runways. Because if you continue on base, as William was asking, that would put a pilot in conflict with the downwind or opposing traffic on an opposite base. So I'm thinking paralleling the runways makes the most sense. I'd probably then correct to get over the center line so that I would increase the spacing from any opposite direction traffic on the other downwind. So those are my thoughts on that. William, thanks so much for sharing that. And here's a comment from Kim's son. He is a doctor who I know here in California, and I thought he really had some good insight here. He said, as a low-time pilot, I think I could have been this pilot, the one we were criticizing. Just recently while training for my commercial, I overshot the final twice, and once a few months after getting my Cirrus, I descended into the pattern at an unfamiliar airport at 150 knots because I just passed a mountain range to get to this airport in the valley. I was descending quickly, I was trying to locate the airport, and as a VFR-only pilot then, I had no idea of which power and attitude would yield which setting. It was only when ATC actually hinted that I was going too fast that I remembered the standard settings. I'm certain the pilot never intended to fly the pattern at those speeds, never intended to overshoot the runways, and of course never intended to ram into the Metroliner. I actually don't think his mistakes are that rare. I have done those stupid things and I was just lucky to not hit anything. We humans are weak in general. I witness the frailty of the human body and spirit every day. Many years ago, an experienced surgeon at a Harvard teaching hospital operated on the wrong leg of a patient. How could that happen? He told me that he had never thought he would make that kind of basic mistake. Just like some of you are currently thinking, you will never make 6 Delta Juliet's mistakes. And of course, that was the Cirrus involved in the midair. He continues, I hope the pilot recovers well from this traumatic experience, that he gets back in the air and tries to become a better pilot. I'm sure he's his toughest critic the past few days. And I hope we have some compassion for him and welcome him back to the community with our open arms. Well, Kim-san, that is really a great message. Thanks so much for sharing that. And yeah, I think that, probably gives all of us, reason to just kind of sit and think, even as we get more experience, we still have to remember that any of us could make a mistake, even with some of the basics in aviation. And here's something that was posted on Facebook by a Cirrus CSIP instructor. He said, I just instituted a new rule. No turns to base above traffic pattern altitude or below 90 or above 110 knots. He said, when I have parallel operations, so 2 or more runways, the downwind width target, which would be the distance the downwind is from the parallel runway, of 1 mile or more, so you don't want to get too close to that runway, And he said if he's within 3/4 of a mile of cross-track for any runway, you can't have a tailwind on the base leg. Good comments there. And here's a comment on Facebook from David. He says, I remember a few years back coming back into KPOC, 2 parallel runways. I was cleared for the left and the guy on the right decided to intercept my final. We were a 1/4 mile apart and both less than a mile from the field, hence low and slow, and I noticed him drifting. Conclusion, situational awareness with parallel runways needs to be increased as there are bozos out there doing wild things. I ended up doing an immediate go-around and the other pilot was given a phone number to call. Scariest moment for me. And here's an email from a CFI in Colorado. He says, Max, I just listened to your episode on the midair at Centennial. I'm a CFI at that airport, and I agree with lots of your points from the show. One thing I'd like to expand upon is the over-reliance on the autopilot. I've flown with a number of pilots who have been trained by CSIPs that are instructing their students to use the autopilot in the VFR traffic pattern. He says, note I'm not a CSIP, which would be a Cirrus Standardized Instructor Pilot. I haven't seen in any Cirrus publication where this is encouraged, and you are correct on that. As we saw with this accident, the autopilot doesn't know what's best, and the PIC has to be ready to take over when the situation dictates. In this scenario, the best course of action would have been a go-around or starting the pattern at the proper airspeeds. I enjoy the show and appreciate all the content. And I followed up with some people at Cirrus about this afterwards, and they confirmed what this pilot and I believe, which is there is no guidance in the Cirrus training material to use autopilots in the traffic pattern. To me, that's just absolutely absurd. The autopilot is not going to be the right tool for being able to make your turns to base and final. It just doesn't turn fast enough. So if you're using the autopilots in the traffic pattern, cut that out. Just ridiculous. In order for that to work, you'd have to be flying an absurdly wide traffic pattern, and generally we don't fly huge traffic patterns. So anyway, just my 2 cents on that. Here's an email from Mahesh in New York. He says, great job on the podcast as always. I just listened to the Centennial episode. I've been following your comments on the thread on COPA, that's the Cirrus Owner Pilots Association. Your 9 and 10 lessons were very instructive. In particular, I'm going to take to heart your encouragement to bank it up to 30 degrees in the pattern. I admit I am one of those pilots who use shallower banks, mostly because I tend to fly wider patterns and don't need a steeper bank. But perhaps I fly wider patterns because I use shallow banks, and so I overshoot if I fly closer. A couple of comments on the Centennial midair. I was going to credit the Cirrus pilot with reacting quickly and pulling the chute, but it was interesting to hear your hypothesis that the chute deployed automatically because of the impact. And by the way, the preliminary NTSB report has come out, and in it says, quote, the pilot reported that the airplane was not controllable after the impact, and he deployed the Cirrus airframe parachute system or CAPS. And Mahesh continues, also, I think that there hasn't been enough recognition given to the Metroliner pilot. He was very professional, and his voice on the radio, even after the collision, was very calm. I think he was a credit to the profession. Keep up the great work on the podcast. I also wanted to let you know that I just donated $100 to the show via PayPal. Hey, thanks so much. I appreciate that, Mahesh. And Flying Magazine senior editor Rob Mark had a comment on the same show.
Hey Max, it's Rob in Chicago. I just wanted to say attaboy on that episode about the midair at Centennial Airport. I think their professionalism, we'll have to wait and see about how that works out, because obviously the pilot on the Cirrus was not completely in touch with what was going on around him, which is dangerous to anybody at any airport. But you and Eric had a really good conversation. I enjoyed the math behind it as well. I think that any pilot that didn't understand the math that you were explaining should probably schedule a little time with their instructor. Because that is absolutely important, valuable information to know. Anyway, nice job. Keep up the good work. We'll see you.
Thanks very much, Rob. And now here's a listener question from Victor.
Hey, Max. This is Victor. Well, I was flying an approach the other day with a Cessna 172 G1000 and selected the baro minima for the LNAV VNAV. However, when it came up, we only had the LNAV. So I was trying to reset the baro minima to the higher minima, but I couldn't find any way of doing that. Seems that the only way to do that would be to reload the approach completely, which once you're actually close enough in, that's probably not a good idea to be deleting the approach and trying to re-enter it. So I was wondering, am I missing a trick, or is there a way to reset that or not? If you could, I think that might be of interest to other people if you know of a way to do that. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much for your question. And I followed up with Victor since he mentioned LNAV/VNAV, and there are very few approaches here in the U.S. And by the way, I know it's different in other countries, but here we have very few approaches with LNAV/VNAV minimums that don't also have LPV minimums. But it turns out that Victor was flying one of those rare approaches, and it was the Tulsa, Oklahoma RNAV 36 left, which has LNAV/VNAV and LNAV minimums, but no LPV minimums. Now, here are a couple of important points. First, with a WAAS-capable GPS receiver, as soon as you cross the intermediate fix, the IF, or as soon as you activate vectors to final, you need to look at the GPS, or if you're flying glass cockpit, you need to look at the HSI to see which minimums have been enunciated. Does it say LPV? Does it say LNAV/VNAV? Does it say LNAV? A lot of pilots don't do this, and they'll miss seeing what Victor saw, which was that his approach had been downgraded to LNAV minimums, which are almost always higher than the LPV or LNAV/VNAV minimums. Victor did catch that downgrade, but then he wanted to be able to enter the new minimums into his system. In many glass cockpits, you load the minimums when you load the approach. So you could go back and reload the approach and enter new minimums that way, but there are a variety of reasons that you may not want to do that, one of which is you will briefly lose course guidance. And by the way, Victor, if you were to do that, you don't need to first delete the old approach. In the Garmin glass cockpits that I fly in, anytime you load a new approach, it just simply wipes out the old approach. So deleting the old approach first is just a wasted step that's unnecessary and really takes up valuable time. Regardless, to change the baro minimums after you've already loaded an approach, just push the timer reference soft key on the PFD. It's the third soft key from the right. You'll find that the bottom line of that screen that it brings up allows you to change the baro minimums. Victor, thanks again for your question. I hope that helps. And coming up next, our conversation with AOPA attorneys Justine Harrison and Jared Allen, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let me tell you a little bit about our guests. Justine Harrison is AOPA's General Counsel and Corporate Secretary. She leads their legal department and oversees AOPA's legal services plan. She's a commercial-rated pilot and flies aircraft ranging from an AirCam experimental that she co-built to a Lear 75. Prior to joining AOPA, Harrison ran her own law firm for a decade after serving as General Counsel of the Nevada Cancer Institute. Jared Allen is managing attorney for AOPA's legal services plan and is an instrument-rated private pilot. The legal services plan helps members with over 5,000 legal matters a year, in addition to medical matters. Now here's our conversation with Justine Harrison and Jared Allen. Well, Justine and Jared, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Well, there was a recent court ruling that could impact how flight instructors do their business, and I understand it's led to a lot of phone calls there. And as I understand it, what's at the crux of this is whether or not flight instruction is considered a commercial activity. Can you just kind of explain historically how has the FAA viewed flight instruction?
Well, sure, we can do that. And Max, I think it's important to know that the crux of this particular case was how can you provide flight instruction in a limited category aircraft? So the case wasn't about flight instruction in general. It was about flight instruction in a limited category aircraft, and specifically FAR 91.315. That was the regulation that was at focus. But when it comes to flight instruction, which is involved in this case, the FAA has traditionally said that flight instruction is instruction, compensated flight instruction is compensation for the instruction you give, not for carrying people around. And so there are multiple legal interpretations out there that talk about this, and there are multiple other places as well in preambles to regulatory promulgation in the Federal Register that say this. So it was a surprise to us all to have this court decision come out that was not about flight instruction in general, but they were asked to review an emergency order to cease and desist. The court's decision was, no, we declined to review it. But then they went on and said a few things about flight instruction, which none of us expected. And that's what's raised some of the questions.
Okay, so as I understand it, in the past, neither the student nor the CFI was considered to be a passenger during flight instruction. So is that why flight instruction hasn't been considered a commercial operation or common carriage?
Jared, do you want to take this one? I know it's a call that you get frequently in the legal services plan.
Yeah, absolutely. So a few things about this case. As Justine mentioned, one of the important takeaways is that this case did not impact one of the regulations, which is 14 CFR 119.1, that talks about the types of operations that require an air carrier certificate. That rule has always had an exclusion for flight instruction or student instruction. And this case has not changed that. But as Justine mentioned, after they decided the immediate issue, this cease and desist order, they provided some commentary on the specific rule at issue, this 91.315, that concerns these limited category aircraft. And this specific rule uses basically the word persons instead of passengers. And so, like you mentioned, even though in the traditional flight instructor and student scenario, neither of those individuals would be considered a passenger, here, this rule is using the word person, which is why the court said that the operation was prohibited.
So I guess flight instruction has kind of been caught up in this inadvertently. Tell us a little bit about the history of the case. How did this all get started?
Sure. So this is an interesting case because there was no particular accident associated with this operation. There was no incident associated with this operation. Rather, it's something that the FAA discovered as part of their surveillance of different types of operations. And as the FAA said in their briefs on the case, their position was that this surveillance of Warbird aircraft, these limited category aircraft, started shortly after the 2019 B-17 crash. And according to the FAA, as part of this surveillance, they surveilled an air tour. And on that air tour was this particular P-40 Warhawk aircraft, Curtiss Wright, beautiful airplanes, of course. And as any beautiful airplane will, it caught the attention of folks around, including FAA inspectors, unfortunately. And that soon led to those FAA inspectors looking at the operation, what was going on. And it didn't take long for them to take the position that this operation, in their opinion, violated this particular rule concerning limited category aircraft. There was a lot of back and forth between the FAA and the operator of this aircraft. A lot of formal communications with the attorneys that were all part of this court hearing and the court case that the DC Circuit heard. Ultimately, though, those conversations and letters exchanged were basically result in the FAA issuing a cease and desist order, like Justine mentioned. And the FAA basically took the position that what was going on was prohibited. And without an assurance from the operator that they were going to stop making these flights, they issued the order. And then the operator had the unique ability to use a particular statute to appeal this cease and desist order directly to the DC Circuit, which is fairly unique because oftentimes these very, not necessarily complex, but unique aviation cases are often heard by, say, NTSB administrative law judges, or they at least start at that level, or perhaps DOT administrative law judges. Here, however, the case went directly to the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, kind of one level below the Supreme Court, if you will. And so these judges that heard this case, although they often hear different types of federal administrative matters, don't often see this type of FAA case come before them.
Well, I guess this was an emergency order. My understanding is that apparently the operator didn't stop providing flight instruction as soon as the inspectors told them that it was prohibited.
Yes, and that's exactly why. If you look at the court opinion, the judges said the reason we are declining, there are three reasons taken together that we are declining to review this emergency order. And they relate to the fact that the owner was told by an inspector that you should not be doing this without an exemption, but continued. And then they got a letter from the FAA's chief counsel making it official that the FAA's position was to give flight instruction in this limited category aircraft, you need to have an exemption. Didn't apply for an exemption and advertised for flight instruction in the P40. And so the FAA said you were continuing after receiving 2 notices from us. And so we moved forward and put an emergency cease and desist order because you gave us no indication that you would stop doing what you're doing.
Well, that's fascinating. So you're saying that essentially it's common to get exemptions to give training in these types of aircraft, but the operator chose not to do that, and that's what led to all this?
Correct. Now, the operator did have some reasonable arguments for why he believed an exemption wasn't needed. But the fact is, there are many exemptions that are out there. And the court specifically said you could have gotten an exemption and you never applied for one.
Okay. So I guess it pays to listen when the FAA suggests you do something?
Yes, but just because they suggest it doesn't mean that that is a requirement or that that's the law. But when you disagree with the FAA, you ultimately have to have somebody be a final determinant of what you can and can't do. And in this case, it was the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. And unfortunately, they didn't come out with the answer that the airman was hoping for.
Well, it sounds like in some way they didn't come out the answer that the FAA was hoping for. Would the FAA perhaps have been happier if they had just denied to review it, but hadn't added these extra comments that they made about flight instruction?
I think it would be a lot simpler if that's what had happened. And we were at first optimistic seeing it was a 2-page opinion because you can't have that much extra language in a 2-page opinion. But unfortunately, there were a couple of sentences in there that did catch our attention, have caused some concern. And we followed up with the FAA to ask, how does this impact flight instruction in general, or does it? Or how does it impact flight instruction in limited category aircraft? How does it impact flight instruction in other categories of aircraft? And we're waiting to get those clarifications.
Okay. So what are the possible outcomes? I mean, this sounds like it's kind of a knotty situation that the FAA now has to kind of figure out how to undo this Gordian knot. What are the possible outcomes?
Well, I do think it's important to note, first of all, the definite outcome. And that is that if you are the owner or operator of a limited category aircraft and you want to receive flight instruction in that aircraft, then you're going to need an exemption from the FAA because that's something that this decision makes very clear. So likewise, if you're a flight instructor who provides flight instruction in these type of limited category aircraft, then again, you're going to need to make sure there's an exemption that permits you to do that. That's the immediate and definite result of this decision. When we talk about the other potential ramifications, these are possibilities, but haven't happened yet. So Justine, I know that you're very familiar with some of the potential consequences here.
So some of the potential consequences when we look at flight instruction being characterized, if it is, which is unclear, but if flight instruction is deemed to be carrying persons for compensation or hire when you get paid, and let's remember the FAA, when it in its legal interpretations, when you say, what is compensation? They say it can be just about anything. It doesn't have to be money. It can be goodwill. It can be the accrual of hours. So just because somebody is not paying money doesn't mean that the FAA may not take the position that compensation is involved, which is why I think it's wise for Jared to say, if you are receiving or providing instruction in a limited category aircraft, make sure that there's an exemption in place. But for the bigger picture, if providing instruction and getting compensation for it is getting compensated for carrying people, that does raise some real issues. That raises issues because, number one, right now you don't have to have a second-class medical to be a flight instructor. Could that be different? Maybe. If flight instruction is deemed to be carrying persons for hire, then it also raises questions in some of the other categories of aircraft, because there's similar language in other categories of aircraft that talk about persons and not just passengers, and carriage of persons and what you can and can't do in those categories of aircraft. So What has happened is by focusing on that word persons, and then by putting in some language around flight instruction and the characterization of that, in the court's opinion, it has raised questions under a whole variety of other similarly worded regulations.
So in the worst case, I guess for commercial type operations, the operator has to have a certificate. In the worst case, what is that saying about flight instructors? What type of certificate could they theoretically need?
Well, going back to what Jared said, remember, you don't need an air carrier certificate to give flight instruction. There's a specific exemption in 119.1. But the question, I think, is more of what type of medical certificate could be required for the instructor here? And in what categories, what hoops do you need to jump through to be allowed to provide instruction in a certain category of aircraft? So as we know with experimentals, you need a LODA if the aircraft is not owned by the student. In limited category aircraft, this case indicates right now, unless the FAA issues a clarification, anybody that gets instruction in a limited category aircraft, even if they own that aircraft, need to have an exemption in place. What would the rules be for standard category aircraft? What would the rules be for other categories of aircraft? That's where the questions get raised.
Okay, so you're saying it's unlikely I need to go out and get a Part 135 certificate to give flight instruction in the future.
Correct.
Okay.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And I'll tell you, we've gotten a flood of calls from flight school owners and instructors across the country asking that very question. Do I need to stop what I'm doing now and go out and try to get a 135 certificate? And by the way, for those folks that have been through that process, if you apply for a 135 certificate, hurry up and wait, because it's not going to happen anytime soon. But the answer, of course, here is that no, it's not required now. This court decision did not stand to mean that you need to go out and get that 135 to do the typical flight instruction that we talk about.
Okay, so it sounds like in the worst case, you're saying the biggest ramification might be flight instructors might be required to have second-class medicals?
Potentially, but I don't think it's going in that direction. And if the FAA tried to take it in that direction, I would tell you they will have a big fight on their hands from a variety of places in the GA community, including from our association. The FAA, I think this is the rule of unintended consequences with broad language issued by judges who don't deal in aviation language every day. So, Max, one of the interesting things is this case, the opinion, the decision was issued in an unpublished opinion. And what that means is the judges themselves said, we don't think we're setting any big precedent here. We don't think we're making any waves. We're just stating what we think is obvious. And therefore, it's an unpublished opinion. And so the judges themselves didn't seem to appreciate the impact of the nuance of some of the language that they use, because it's not the language they use on a daily basis. And so what's important to note here is the FAA traditionally has not wanted to create a large and bureaucratic pathway to training. They know that training is the key to safety. And we all want to make sure that those pathways to access training as often as you want or need it are wide, and they're open and they're easy, and we don't have a lot of hurdles, because training is the key to safety. And I think that's something that we can all agree on, even the FAA.
We brought up experimental aircraft a moment ago, and I think in general people are unable to provide flight instruction in, flight school experimental aircraft, if there were such a thing. But I know that, for example, owners of experimental aircraft can get instruction in their own personal aircraft. Explain what the LODA is that you referenced and how that can help people with instruction in experimental aircraft.
Sure. So I actually fly an experimental aircraft. And a lot of us, when we get into an experimental aircraft, we don't already have make and model time, whether you're buying one or you're building one. But we know that it's really important to be able to fly one and to get that make and model time and accrue the skills in the airframe you're going to be flying. Now, the FAA says because of the experimental nature, And every experimental is essentially a one-off, particularly on the amateur build side. The FAA says we want to put in an extra layer of protection if you don't own the plane you're flying. And the important part for this is to understand that the FAA clearly delineates between paying for instruction in an experimental versus paying for the plane that you use during the instruction with the experimental. But they have this LOTA process, and the letter of deviation authority is something you can get through your local FSDO. So unlike with a limited category where they're saying right now you need to apply for an exemption, and that request goes to headquarters and has quite a bit of process behind getting a response to that, a LOTA is a relatively efficient and local process for you to be able to use a third-party plane for experimental training.
And that would make a lot of sense for a new builder who wants to get trained in type before they have their own aircraft finished. Mm-hmm. Are they allowed to pay rental for the use of that aircraft in addition to paying someone to give them flight instruction if they have a LOTA?
Correct. So that's the key to being able to accept compensation for use of the aircraft, is having that LOTA in place. And so with limited category aircraft, there are exemptions right now, and there are over 300 limited category aircraft currently on the FAA's registry. But there are not that many exemptions. There's only a dozen or 2 dozen exemptions out there. So there's a big gap right now in the number of exemptions versus aircraft. And so the FAA has some options and can look at how it's handled some of the challenge with other categories of aircraft if it wants to consider something other than the exemption process to be able to deal with those who want to get training. And they may look at and say, well, the pathway you need to use depends upon whether you own the plane you're getting training in or somebody else is supplying the plane. But again, these are things that the FAA has considered before for other categories, and we'll be taking a look at as we move forward to see how do we make sure that everybody who flies or wants to fly limited category aircraft has a clear and easy pathway to that training.
Got it. Well, as we start to wrap up here, any other things that you'd like to mention about this particular case and its ramifications for flight instruction?
What I would say is, just to reiterate what Jared said before, this has immediate ramifications if you're providing or receiving flight instruction in a limited category aircraft. Beyond that, it's unclear. AOPA, EAA, and GAMA jointly sent a letter to the FAA asking for clarifications. We have not yet received feedback on that, but we look forward to receiving clarification and sharing that with everyone. So in the absence of clarification on the broader issues, we are thinking through concerns, we are thinking through downstream potential consequences, but there's no need for immediate action until we have more clarity of what we're dealing with. And it is very possible that the FAA could come back and say, we are not changing our position on the characterization of flight training compensation. We've always said that it's compensation for the instruction, and we're not changing our position on that. So we really need more information from the FAA before we can identify whether there are bigger concerns and how we need to address those concerns.
Okay. Well, before we go, take a moment and tell us a little bit about AOPA's legal services plan.
Yeah, absolutely, Max. And I'm glad you mentioned it because one of my final comments here was going to be that if you are a member of AOPA's Pilot Protection Services and have questions about this issue, particularly if you're a flight instructor, don't wait until you've already made the flight to give us a call and ask, hey, was that legal or am I going to be in trouble? Call us before you make the flight. That's always a good idea. So for AOPA's Pilot Protection Services, which includes our legal services plan, it's something that's available only to AOPA members. We've got about 300,000 members or so these days, and about 70,000 members have opted into our legal services plan. And generally how it works is that in exchange for your membership, you have access to not just in-house AOPA attorneys like myself, who can provide some initial advice, help you understand regulatory requirements, and guide you through these types of interesting legal issues that may pop up throughout your flying. But should the worst happen and you find yourself faced with an FAA legal enforcement action, or you have an aircraft accident or incident we will get you in touch with a local attorney, and you're going to have a certain number of hours paid for by the legal services plan to help with your legal fees associated with that event. So we see it work time and time again where folks who otherwise would not have access to an aviation attorney, because they're a member of the legal services plan, are able to either get the advice they need or mount a defense to FAA enforcement actions. So certainly it's something we recommend for all of our members, but we're always happy to talk about it.
Well, in addition to some of the defense work, the other interesting thing that we do that everybody may not realize, and it's been a very busy part lately, has been purchase and sale transactions. So if you are buying or selling a plane or leasing a plane or leasing a hangar, we can help with that. That's one of our benefits. So as you know, it's a pretty hot market right now for aircraft purchase and sales. So I know that our phone has been ringing more often than usual, helping people buy, sell, create partnerships, create flying clubs, and secure hangars and tie downs.
And where would people go to find out more information about AOPA and your legal services programs?
You can go to aopa.org.
Pretty straightforward. Well, Jared and Justine, thank you so much for spending time with us here today, and thank you for all the great work that you and AOPA do to help support the general aviation community.
And thanks for all you do to help educate all of us, Max, and for all the flying and instruction that you do.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having us.
And my thanks to both Justine Harrison and Jared Allen for joining us today to clarify that situation. If you want to learn more about AOPA and their legal services program, just go to aopa.org. Now, here are just a couple of updates. I want to mention something nice that happened a few months ago. I am holding a very nice heavy glass award that was given out by Cirrus Aircraft earlier this year. They have a Cirrus Safety Award that they give out to one person in the entire world. And guess what? This one has my name on it. It says Cirrus Approach Safety Award 2020. Now, I know last year that it was given out to collectively all the instructors in the CFIP program. That's the Cirrus Pilot Proficiency Program, which is taught by instructors through COPA, the Cirrus Owner Pilots Association. I'll go ahead and include a picture of this in the chapter markers, but I want to thank Cirrus very much for this award. And by the way, when they gave this to me, they cited this podcast in particular and the millions of downloads that it's had and its contribution to safety around the world for pilots, not just flying Cirrus aircraft, but to all aircraft. So anyway, this is very meaningful to me, and it's actually got pictures of my favorite two airplanes on there. It's got engraved the Vision Jet and the SR20. Speaking of the Vision Jet, I was out flying in one today. Great fun. Brand new airplane at San Jose that had all of 20 hours on it. It just came out from the factory, but it needed to get relocated to the owner's home airport. And it was at San Jose because that's where they dropped off the instructor pilot who came out with the owner from the factory. And so I got to move it out to the Central Valley. Short flight, but quite fun. The aircraft is just beautiful, and it still has that new airplane smell inside, which really made it special as well. Nice flight out of San Jose. They asked me if I wanted to take off at intersection Delta, which I think leaves you with 7,000 feet. And I said, no, I'll take the full length. I just like to use full length whenever I can. If you think about it this way, if you had some kind of issue after you got in the air and were still at low altitude, if you still have a few extra 1,000 feet of runway, you might be able to put it back down on the ground. And if that were to happen, after I had run out of runway because I took intersection Delta, well, that would be kind of sad. So I used the full length of the runway just to build that little extra margin and safety into that takeoff. So that was great fun, and I posted a very short video on my Facebook page, just showing what the view looked like from up there in the Vision Jet and its beautiful glass cockpit. And I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that I started adding chapter markers and photos to help you navigate the show. So my thanks to Patreon supporters Stephen Elop, Larry Noe, and Albert, who gave feedback saying, yes, they liked them. I did have feedback from someone else who said, nah, they're not that big a deal, which I think is probably true. I looked at my phone and I found that after a few seconds of listening, the screen goes dark and you don't even see the photos or the chapter markers. So as I mentioned, I may include them some of the time, but don't count on them all the time. By the way, Josh in Illinois corrected me. He said that the Overcast app at least on iOS, does support chapters and the photos that I uploaded. And he is absolutely correct on that. I found that when I was in the Overcast app, I was just on the wrong screen, but if I swiped, I could then find the photos that I'd uploaded. And perhaps a month ago, I mentioned a show coming up on Nova, which was postponed. But it's now going to be out later this week. It's called the Great Electric Airplane Race. It's on NPR on the Nova program with Miles O'Brien. And it's not about a race. I thought that's what it was. Instead, it says they look at an array of promising new electric airplanes, and they take you for a ride in some impressive prototypes that are already in the air. So it's not a race like a traditional race, but it's just all about electric aircraft and how they're doing. So that's going to air on Wednesday, May 26th, so check your local PBS station. By the way, there was an earlier episode just a few days ago on Nova called Hindenburg, the New Evidence, and it was fascinating. They located a new piece of film on the Hindenburg that was taken from a different angle than all the previous footage that people have seen, and they did a number of experiments in which they built mock-ups of the construction of the outer airbag wrapped around the airframe. And in the testing, they believe they came up with the answer to the 80-year-old question of where did that spark came from that ignited the hydrogen, causing the disaster? And the answer is that once they dropped those ropes to the ground, the Hindenburg became essentially a huge capacitor storing electrical charges because it was raining and there was lightning in the area. And because of the construction, there were little tiny sparks created all throughout the entire superstructure. And one of those sparks, unfortunately, happened to be near a leak in the hydrogen. So that's a fascinating episode. You may want to check it out. Check your local listings for PBS on Wednesday, May the 26th. And here's a quick email I got from Eric Earhart, who's a PhD. He says, Max, in episode 181, you mentioned AOPA's April Sea Green Challenge, which was about landing at airports with grass runways. He said that I've computed the shortest tour of all airports within a state by solving the traveling salesman problem, which, of course, is a classic problem of how somebody could have the minimum distance to travel to a number of different cities. He's figured out how to do that for all airports for each state. He says, I have subsets for paved runways and grass dirt strips. I've included maps, tables, and even KML files to read into Google Earth to plan your route. This is an approximation to the quickest way to get the most grass strip check-ins. And he gives a web address here that you can go to. Go to tinyurl.com/pilot-tsp. And that'll take you to a really fascinating map of all these little paths that are the shortest routes around each state to visit every airport in your state. And if you end up doing that, let me know. We'll talk about it here on the show. And Eric says he's a member of the Cooperative Crossroads Flying Club, the oldest flying club in New Mexico. Eric, thanks for sending that. And here's a little inside baseball. Before I started doing this podcast, I had no idea how much time it would take. In fact, it's a good thing I didn't know, because if I had known, frankly, I probably wouldn't have started it. It's probably about 20 hours a week, which you can think of as basically half a work week. So that's time when I can't be out teaching, which is my main way to make a living. So I am highly appreciative to everyone who takes just a couple of minutes out of their time to send a little thank you for doing the show by signing up to support the show financially, either through Patreon or PayPal. So let me mention people who have signed up in the last 2 weeks to support the show. Several people who have signed up at the $20 a month level. They include Mallory Fuller, Salvatore Sadati, Andrew Hayek, and Steve Bloom and Jamie Gamble are prior supporters who edited their pledges up to $20 a month. Thanks so much. That means they now have access to all of the bonus videos that I've posted through Patreon. Other new supporters include Timothy Juntunen, Zachary Israel, and Greg Kevin. And to sign up via Patreon, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. It'll take you just a couple of minutes to select a support level and to enter your credit card. We also have several one-time donations, and if you'd like to make just a one-time donation, that's an easy thing to do. Go out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. Think about how much you might pay for an hour of flight instruction, and you might consider sending that along as a monthly donation. And we have some one-time donations from Dirk Frobes, $100, Mahesh Sankaran, $100, Mike Blade, $50, Rebecca Salisbury, and Anthony Pitt. Thank you so much for all of your donations. And of course, we have our mega supporters who donate $50 a month and up. They get a free book from me after 2 months. They include Brian Deere, who recently moved to the Houston, Texas area. He has a Turbo 206. Matt Souza, he's a computer engineer who worked for Embraer in Brazil. He's now in Chicago and a student pilot flying a 152 out of Chicago Executive Airport. Tyson Weiss, co-founder and CEO of ForeFlight, which is a popular EFB app. Bruce Dickerson, he's a financial planner living in Georgia, and he flies a K-35 Bonanza. Dave Brochet, he recently retired from the Navy and is working on his instrument rating in a Cherokee 140 at the Navy Flying Club in Jacksonville. Kent Mazia, he and his wife Misty own a 2007 Cirrus at the Alpine Air Park in Wyoming and have a passion for helping others by flying volunteer missions for Angel Flight. Victor Vogel, he's a dock in Central PA and flies a Cirrus. Tim Delaney, wealth manager in Eagle, Idaho, flies a Turbo SR20 out of Nampa. Stephen Elop, who, by the way, appears on the cover of my brand new G3000 and G5000 Glass Cockpit Handbook. He flies a Turbo 182 and a Citation CJ3+. He's the CEO of API Jet. Mike Williams, he's the president of TCB Composites. They make composite spinners and bulkheads for GA aircraft, and he flies a 172. Seth Lake, he's a DPE giving check rides, and he specializes in teaching the multi-engine rating. So if you're interested in getting your multi-engine rating and can travel to Arkansas, check out vsl.aero. Rick Miller instructs in the Cincinnati area, both out of the Lunken Flight Training Center and with private owners of Pipers, Cessnas, Beechcraft, and Cicadas. He'd love to teach full-time, but still has that day job. Justin Winters, he brokers real estate on Lake Keowee in South Carolina and flies an SR-22. Carl and Ann Rossi of Maine Cooncat Aviation. They've got a pair of Cessna T240s and a Piper M350 on order. Johnny McDade, he's a singer-songwriter, musician, and record producer. Jim Goldfuss, flying out of the Republic Airport on Long Island. He's training for his CFI and meanwhile is teaching as a ground instructor at the Pilot Proficiency International. He can also be reached on his Facebook page of Ground Point 9 if you'd like to get individual instruction online. Vincent Salimi, Vice Mayor for the City of Pinole. He's the owner of Salimi Construction Management in San Francisco and president of the Concord Flying Club, the oldest continually operating club west of the Mississippi. Jim Hopp, he's a CFI and teaches at Advantage Aviation at the Palo Alto Airport. Joseph Sheehan flew in the Navy for 8 years and now has a few hundred hours in his new Vision Jet. Josiah Freeman, he's working on his instrument rating. Dylan Caldwell, he's an AME. He gives medical exams, so if you are looking for your basic med, second or third class flight physical, and you are near Naples, Florida, you can contact him at aviatorsclinic.com. William Birch donates to the show in the memory of his son, Lieutenant J.G. Wallace Birch, who was a naval aviator. Don Hakela with Professional Instrument Courses. They conduct 10-day instrument courses, IFR finish-up, and IFR refresher courses. Check them out at iflyifr.com. Don Dillman, he's a professional pilot who runs an airline flight department. He's also CFI and flies a Bonanza. Rick Mattis, an owner of Pointwise, which makes CFD simulation software used by aerospace companies. You can find them at pointwise.com. John Tosto lives in Flint, Michigan, and he rents some of the planes at the Greater Flint Pilots Association. He also co-owns a Cherokee 6 that's been updated with a Garmin G3X and GTN 650. Vic Bajaj, who I just flew again with recently, lives here in the San Francisco Bay Area and flies a Cirrus. Mark Holzbach, he lives in southwestern PA. He's a longtime aviation enthusiast who wants to get his private when he retires in a few years. He runs BoddenSteel.com, which manufactures industrial fasteners. Tim Crawford, he flies the DA-40 out of Crosswinds Aviation at the Oakland County Airport north of Detroit. He runs a company called BrainSpring that helps kids with dyslexia. Greg Van, he's a senior AME at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, New York, and he hosts the Mayo Clinic Clear Approach podcast, which discusses medical issues for pilots. James Kerr, he's thinking about buying an SR-22 for business travel. His company makes security screens for protecting your home, and you can find out more at bosssecurityscreens.com. Orel English, he's a CFI and II at the Westchester Flying Club in Westchester County Airport, New York. He and a friend have created a website to make free flight planning modern and fast. The site is called Flyway, and you can check it out at flyway.cc. Ed Kelly flies a Saratoga out of Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, and says his 2-year-old son, Bennett, is the best co-pilot he could have. Jeff Brausch is one of our supporters. Michael Ron, he runs a small wealth management firm in Woodland, Texas, and you can find them at thesumplanning.com, and he's thinking about buying a Cirrus. Todd Kussel, he lives in Arizona and flies an SR-22T. And Chris Carnahan, who's president of Boone Valley Forest Products and flies a VTOL Bonanza out of Spirit Airport in St. Louis. Thanks to everyone who contributes to the show in whatever way you do. And if you love the show and you'd like to support us in other ways, well, you can head on out to your podcast app and leave a 5-star review. You can also tell your friends about the show and encourage them to sign up to either follow or subscribe to the podcast. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.